Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm director of the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Welcome to today's event titled Re-examining the Nuclear Past of Kazakhstan and Ukraine through the prism of the war. And I would say two-thirds of our events these days start with a reference to Russia's war against Ukraine, and understandably so, because it's such a huge shattering development for our region, for Central Asia, for Eurasia, and it makes us think and rethink developments in our past, decisions that we made. Now we are facing again big questions: who is a friend, who is a foe, what security assurances mean, what security guarantees mean. Did we take too many things for granted? So these are big and existential questions. And one important aspect, of course, is the nuclear aspect. As all of us know, at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, 4 republics inherited the Soviet arsenal, including Kazakhstan and Ukraine. And that was not an easy decision for the governments of these newly independent states to make, to denuclearize. And we have 2 authors of 2 books that actually tell the story of the denuclearization. Dr. Mariana Bujerin and Dr. Togzhan Kasyanova with us today to assess and reassess this decision to denuclearize, why it was made, maybe go over again the reasons why it was made, and what were the implications, what are the implications of these decisions. Let me quickly introduce our speakers. First, Dr. Mariana Bujerin, who is a senior research associate at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfast Center for the project of managing the atom. Formerly, she held the appointments of a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Managing the Atom Project and a visiting professor at Tufts University, and his research is in Frankfurt. Her research and analytical contributions appeared in a number of high-profile international security journals and outlets. But most importantly for us, she is the author of the book Inheriting the Bomb: The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, that was published last year. Actually, both books were published last year. Just pretty, the timing just, pretty amazing, I would say. Our second speaker is Dr. Togzhan Kasyanova, who is a DC-based senior fellow with the Project on International Security, Commerce, and Economic Statecraft at the Center for Policy Research in Albany. And she's also a non-resident fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's an expert on nuclear politics and financial crime prevention. And she is the author of the second book we will be discussing today, Atomic Set: How Kazakhstan Gave Up the Bomb, which came out 9 days after the beginning of the war. Before the war started, and Mariana's book was published in December last year. So without further ado, let me first give the floor to Mariana, and then we'll go to Togzhan. Mariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nargis, for this very kind introduction, and many thanks for Togzhan, not only for traveling from DC to take part in this joint event. I'll be very honest, we conspired to have a joint book event at some point, some time ago. And it's so lovely to actually be able to sit here and right next to her, and she's been so supportive, actually, because she's charted the course with the book ahead of me. So many thanks. This is certainly a very timely topic for both of our books under rather unfortunate circumstances. there is a lot of kind of re-examining and rethinking and hankering back to the nuclear history of Ukraine, but also Kazakhstan and other post-Soviet states at this point when security is front and center of debates in the region. In Ukraine in particular, there's a pronounced narrative of regret over the nuclear decision-making in the early 90s. And the narrative that emerged, not just since the war, probably since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in eastern Ukraine, is that Ukraine inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal from the Soviet Union in 1991 and gave it away for nothing but empty promises, referring to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurance to Ukraine, signed by Ukraine and the three depository states of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, namely the United States, United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation, which 20 years later turned around and blatantly violated these security commitments pledged to Ukraine. And basically, nothing really bad happened to Russia afterwards. So in a sense, that narrative is understandable, even if it has to be taken with a huge grain of salt. In the West, I think in particular in 2014, many people just kind of woke up to these mentions of Budapest Memorandum and started digging in Wikipedia to see what that document precisely was and what exactly happened in the early 90s. There was generally an amazing amount of forgetting that happened, even with the nuclear experts and people who should have known better. But those who do remember the events, and even many people who took direct part in the process of denuclearization, their narrative is, well, these countries had no options. The outcome was predetermined. Those weren't their weapons to give up in the first place. Those were Russian weapons because Russia succeeded the Soviet Union as a nuclear weapon state under the NPT. And those countries never had the command and control over the weapons in their territory. That's another narrative that needs to be taken with a huge grain of salt. As someone who has researched this for many, many years, embarrassingly many years, and I'm sure Tigran could corroborate, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's more complicated and it's more nuanced. And this is what these two books are about. Ukraine did have options and it did have agency. One of the reasons for this kind of Western blindness in particular is that there has been a perennial conflation dating back from the coldest days of the Cold War of the Soviet Union and Russia. Experts who, should have known better, who were deeply involved with this subject, would allow themselves to use these terms interchangeably. Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, it was all the same. Because all the decades of interaction with Moscow, right, that was kind of a Russian-dominated type of setting. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, suddenly, the world woke up to a reality of 15 new states, about which, a lot of people haven't even heard before. And it was as if kind of the earth opened up and out of it sprung the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks and the Georgians and the Ukrainians. Where did they come from? And, what do they want? Why are they staking some kind of claims in this international arena suddenly? And so these blind spots or this kind of conflation creates a blind spot in which the process of negotiating a post-Soviet settlement, the process of transition from the Soviet Union to Russia, especially in the nuclear realm, becomes rather invisible, but it was not. It took negotiation, it took settlement, it took considering decisions and considering options. And Ukraine, but also Kazakhstan, as Tigran will talk about, did have those options and did have agency. And the fact that in the end, they decided to make the right decision does not obliviate the fact that there was a decision to be made. States make bad decisions all the time. Look at Russia, right? And it made a pretty bad decision to invade Ukraine, and it's paying the consequences. Everyone else is too. In Ukraine, many things went into the decision-making on nuclear weapons, and I'd be happy to discuss them in more detail. But let me just sum up some of the domestic drivers and some of the international constraints which Ukraine encountered. Ukraine did end up with a really handsome proliferation starter package, if you want to call it that way. No, it did not have command control over these weapons. But yes, it was technically feasible to establish that command and control, especially in Ukraine that was well endowed with missile building, with of all sorts, intercontinental, cruise missile, but also build its own aircraft. So there was a military industrial potential, military industrial capacity, which Ukraine could have leveraged, as well as nuclear science and the rest of it, if it wanted to pursue a nuclear deterrent of its own. In the end, it decided not to pursue a nuclear deterrent of its own for a variety of reasons, partially economic. It would have taken a great deal of investment. Even if it wasn't a great deal, it was still a lot to divert from other parts of the economy that was struggling in the time when the transition from the Soviet planned economy to what everyone hoped would be a free market and more fair economy was really quite challenging. And another set of reasons had to do with the international order and the environment into which Ukraine and other post-Soviet successors entered. That world was not a free-for-all. It was not, an anarchy where states could just do as they please. It had institutions, it had expectations, and if you went against those expectations, there would have been consequences. And Ukraine had to wait as well as Kazakhstan and Belarus to weigh those consequences. Part and parcel of this international order was the global nuclear order, right? That had, with NPT at its core, it recognized 5 nuclear weapon states. Others were expected not to develop nuclear weapons. Clearly, there are states in the system that went against that expectation and had to bear consequences for it. But at the time, as a fledgling sovereign, as a fledgling independent state, Ukraine and other post-Soviet successors mostly wanted to join that international order on good terms. They wanted to be good international citizens and not defy, not that they had leverage and resources to do that anyways, but not to defy this international non-proliferation consensus. In 1994, then, Ukraine, as well as Kazakhstan and Belarus, joined the International Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states and proceeded to transfer weapons out of their territory, nuclear weapons, but also dismantle delivery vehicles with the help and support of the technical assistance from the United States. Fast forward to now. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Now, fast forward to now. With the deal, as it were, that was part and parcel of this non-proliferation story, this disarmament story, that deal being breached by one of the guarantors, assurers, whichever you call it, signatories of the Budapest Memorandum, states that pledged these security commitments to Ukraine, but also to Kazakhstan and Belarus in the same vein. Questions arise, well, what are the consequences then? Not just for Ukraine's security, for which clearly suffers, but also for the broader international non-proliferation regime. And it has been my argument, my contention, that because of this history, because the Budapest Memorandum and the commitments that were pledged to Ukraine, but also to Kazakhstan and Belarus, I mean, they're basically copy-pasted all 3 countries as they came as kind of part of the same case of post-Soviet proliferation. The consequences of the breach of this document reach far further than just kind of the Ukrainian security that suffers for it, that wasn't sufficiently protected for it. The credibility of the entire non-proliferation regime is at stake here. The credibility of negative security assurances, which is the special responsibility of nuclear states not to abuse their privileged position under the NPT in order to further their own kind of selfish national aims. And so at the same time, as kind of the non-proliferation part of the global nuclear order is under strain, the actual role of nuclear weapons is somewhat more ambiguous than many of us would like to admit in this case. Deterrence for the fear of nuclear escalation seems to work to contain the conflict in the original theater in Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine alone, with the original two belligerents. Now almost a year and a half into this conflict, nobody else has joined the fray. And states of the West, that are committed to help Ukraine, to support Ukraine, have said very clearly, even before the war began, they're not joining. They're not going to come in and get involved directly in this conflict. Why? Because of the very justifiable and very real fears of nuclear escalation. And so, with kind of deterrence proving its worth, unfortunately for many of us who would like to think otherwise, and the non-proliferation regime taking a bit of a beating there with Ukraine's history, it remains to be seen exactly how the conclusion of this war, because it will conclude, will impact the actual value of nuclear weapons as tools of international statecraft. Let's hope that Ukraine does prevail, right, whatever that means, against a larger, a more powerful nuclear armed adversary. But even if it does, the costs at this point are already so high, where a country in a similar security predicament as Ukraine might ask, well, what can we do to prevent this from happening in the first place? It's no solace to us to know that, we killed so many thousands Russians, fine. But how have we prevented that from happening in the first place? And the job of convincing such states that the answer is not nuclear weapons has just gotten a lot harder. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Let's continue. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you for being here, and thank you to Davis Center for hosting us. And it's just my honor and my pleasure to share the podium with Mariana. Mariana became my personal hero over the last year, because even just on book writing, for those who wrote the books and prepared manuscripts for submission, it's a really stressful and difficult time. But imagine doing it while your country is under attack, when you cannot get in touch with your family because, I don't know, electricity goes out for 24 hours because of missile attacks, and also doing all the awareness raising and expert interviews. And so I think Mariana's book is really a testament, one more testament to the resilience of Ukrainians as a nation, and to Mariana personally. I have goosebumps as I'm speaking it, because I just admire what you've done and what you're doing. I want to pick up on what Mariana started addressing, the question of agency, and use Kazakhstan's case, and I'll cover agency, Kazakhstan's option. I'll try to answer whether it was a mistake for Kazakhstan to say no to nuclear weapons. And finally, I want to just speak a little bit about the question of nuclear justice and how Kazakhstan's nuclear past is seen now in the current circumstances of the ongoing war of Russia against Ukraine. So first question, was it Kazakhstan's choice to make? I also find it really a little bit troubling that there is now this trend, the narrative that neither Ukraine or Kazakhstan had agency over their nuclear choice. Soviet nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine were not by default Russian weapons. They were Soviet weapons, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion that they had to be moved to Russia. Speaking about Kazakhstan, of course, there were very serious limitations. Kazakhstan did not have physical access to command and control of Soviet weapons, and it understood very well that, if it somehow tried to get physical access to facilities with nuclear weapons that were guarded by military force controlled by from Moscow, that it would lead to an open conflict with Russia, which of course was not a good option for Kazakhstan, especially noting the large presence of ethnic Russians within Kazakhstan. There were worries even of a civil war if there is an open conflict with Russia. And then an important point, the Soviet de facto discrimination policy based on ethnicity meant that there were, like, you could count on the fingers of one hand the number of ethnic Kazakhs who were part of the Soviet strategic forces. So, the practical question would be, who would maintain those weapons if somehow access was achieved? Or how would you change the pits in those weapons and so on? But Kazakhstan was a sovereign state, and under the provisions of the Soviet dissolution, whatever property was on the territory of each republic at the time of the collapse was the property of that new independent state. Of course, nuclear weapons were in a category of their own, but they were not Russian nuclear weapons. They were Soviet nuclear weapons, and if we speak about Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan's land was abused pretty terribly, and its resources were used to build part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The legal status of Soviet nuclear weapons present on the territory of Kazakhstan was not formally defined until March of 1994, when Russia and Kazakhstan signed agreements which spelled out the status of these weapons. What I'm trying to say is that there was a lot of uncertainty in the beginning, in the early 90s. I want, for example, to bring up the documents signed at the end of 1991, when the Soviet Union was being dissolved and the Commonwealth of Independent States was created. There were a couple of documents, short, not very detailed, attached to Alma-Ata Declaration and Minsk Declaration. And basically, in those documents, in the passages about destruction of nuclear weapons, Kazakhstan was not even mentioned. And Nazarbayev, first I want to mention Yeltsin. When Yeltsin called President Bush after Alma-Ata Declaration, he said, there will be some strategic nuclear weapons maintained in Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev called James Baker, and he said the following: strategic nuclear weapons will remain in Russia and Kazakhstan. However, Kazakhstan will declare itself a non-nuclear zone when it's admitted to the United Nations. And so there was definitely, there were some conversations going on between Kazakhstan and Russia, Yeltsin specifically. And nobody in Washington, Almaty, Kiev, or Minsk, Moscow knew how things would develop. In the United States, for example, one of the first key studies that was done here at Harvard University at Belfer Center, called Soviet Nuclear Fission, authored by Ash Katzer and his colleagues, it discussed three potential scenarios that we might have 4 nuclear states, maybe 1 nuclear state, for Russia, or maybe there would be complete disarmament. If you read the US embassy cables from these early months of 1992, you can really see the level of uncertainty about what Kazakhstan might do. On the Kazakh side, and here I want to bring up the study authored by my father and then the head of the Center for Strategic Studies. In that study, Kazakh advisors to the president, they discussed 3 scenarios: Kazakhstan as a nuclear state, joint control over nuclear weapons with Russia or under the CIS umbrella or complete disarmament. So even on the weapons, there were these different scenarios discussed, and I think we should treat the conversation on nuclear material and infrastructure in Kazakhstan as separately, because if on Soviet weapons there were definitely very important limitations with the material and infrastructure, Kazakhstan from the very beginning had full control. And it's, as Mariana said, Ukraine had even more. So if Ukraine had an excellent starter pack, Kazakhstan had a good one. It was definitely, not in any weaker position than North Korea or Pakistan to start developing a latent nuclear program if it chose to. And so Kazakhstan's decision to give up Soviet nuclear weapons, but more importantly, to give up nuclear material and dismantle infrastructure, was a conscious and strategic choice made for reasons of Kazakhstan's interests and considerations. And of course, the US diplomacy played a huge role, and also US assistance. And so I think, what I hope the audience would take from this discussion is that although significantly constrained by technical and political factors, Kazakhstan had the agency over the choice on what to do with nuclear weapons, but especially on nuclear material and facilities. So now the second question, did Kazakhstan make a mistake? The Soviet system, it kind of consumed Kazakhstan alive. When I was writing this, I was thinking about those predatory plants that, look all nice from the outside, but they eat you alive, for their own energy. And Kazakhstan almost lost its identity and language. My generation, for example, we didn't speak Kazakh. There were only 2 Kazakh language schools in the capital city. And Kazakhstan also lost millions of its people and had part of its land turned into wasteland, famine due to collectivization, similar as in Ukraine, political repressions, imprisonment and murder of Kazakh prominent intelligentsia, Soviet nuclear tests, experiments with Soviet biological weapons. And so, if, for example, I know you are very informed audience, but as Mariana alluded to, for average person outside, including in this country, how many heard that Kazakhs existed as all others in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union was this Slav-looking Russian person. And so, when I'm reminding all this to evoke the context of those early days of independence in Kazakhstan, that suddenly you have this independence, you can enter the world on your own terms, you can present yourself the way you want. And granted, Kazakhstan's top leadership, was Soviet apparatchiks, including Nazarbayev, but still there was this, it was really thrilling that you can build up your own statehood and sovereignty, especially once it was clear that renewed union was not possible. And it's through this prism that we should view Kazakhstan's decisions on nuclear matters. The main themes were surviving as a state and building a nation, was national identity. On the security side, Kazakhstan was definitely worried about Russia and China. But how would strategic nuclear weapons to which Kazakhstan didn't have access help with this kind of security vulnerabilities and threats? And on the sovereignty and statehood side, what was more important was to take your economy off the ground, which was in complete shambles. And for that, you needed foreign direct investment, foreign technology, access to markets. And so, as Mariana mentioned, the norms were important. You couldn't get all those things, and Kazakhstan understood it very well if you tried to push against those norms. And, the norms were that there were only 5 nuclear states under the NPT, and others could join as non-nuclear weapon states. And of course, we can debate the fairness of these nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. It's relevant but separate conversation. But the fact was, the norms existed, and they continue to exist. And where would Kazakhstan and Ukraine be as countries if they made a different choice? But they did it in return for security assurances. For Kazakhstan, as for Ukraine, it was fundamental that there would be some commitment to their security. And I think that, especially now during this war, and with the context that Mariana explained, it's so important that Kazakhstan's and Ukraine's non-nuclear choice is acknowledged and celebrated, because for many understandable reasons, there are now all these questions of whether Ukraine made a mistake, and because the global non-proliferation regime is under such a stress. And so I strongly believe that the emphasis should be not on whether Ukraine and Kazakhstan made a mistake. They did the right choice for them at the time, and that was in line with the international norms. The focus should be on why and how it was possible for Russia to trump on its commitments and international norms. And finally, just very briefly, I want to address the question of Kazakhstan's nuclear past in the context of the ongoing war. I was in Kazakhstan in September of 2022 to launch the Kazakh version of Atomic Step with the help of Friedrich Ebert Foundation Kazakhstan and Stephen World Publishing. And so September 2022, it's the second wave of mobilization in Russia. So a lot of Russian men in Kazakhstan. And I could observe the tension between helping those who need help and Central Asian hospitality and, ties between people in Kazakhstan and Russia, but also concerns about what it means for Kazakhstan, from something very, mundane and practical. Jobs, rents were going up, to national security and geopolitics, but more importantly, also in the context of majority of people in Kazakhstan feeling affinity for Ukraine and being extremely disturbed by Russia's war against Ukraine. I underestimated how Kazakhstan's nuclear past would be relevant to what was happening, and how the discussion of the nuclear past within Kazakhstan would fit into a broader discourse on decolonization. And of course, the questioning of the Soviet past in Kazakhstan didn't start overnight. It didn't start with the war, but the war accelerated. It put this entire process on steroids, and I definitely see the war as the final step in the Soviet collapse. And one important theme that ran through all my talks in Kazakhstan, and the questions that I received, especially from the young generation, even from school kids, it was a question that, as a scholar, I see that they were asking about nuclear justice. They were asking about Russia's responsibility for the continued legacy of Soviet nuclear tests in Kazakhstan, because people are still suffering in the areas next to the former testing site. And of course, one might say the tests were conducted by the Soviet government, which doesn't exist anymore. But who is benefiting from those weapons now? Who is using them to blackmail the rest of the world? And Russia is very selective about what it decides to inherit, like the UN seat, and what, it kind of says nothing. It has nothing to do with us. I doubt Russia will come through on this issue of nuclear justice or acknowledgement of the continued legacy of Soviet nuclear program in Kazakhstan. But I just want to kind of end my remarks on just bringing this to light and saying the new generation in Kazakhstan, it sees the Soviet past very differently. Their minds are completely decolonized. They are not they don't have sensitivity about really asking this very to the point questions, and I think they will be the ones who will demand nuclear justice.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mariana, do you want to make remarks? Okay, then can I ask a couple of historical questions first? Well, you mentioned that for the outside world, Russian and Soviet meant Russian, and actually, well, even here at the data center, where the kind of the nationalities question in the Soviet Union was always a big thing. There was a lot of research on that. It was launched as a Russian research center in 1948, but obviously it was a union, and the republics could claim ownership over parts of the Soviet nuclear program. How did Kazakhstan and Ukraine claim ownership over, over parts of this nuclear program? The second question is, you both emphasized weighing consequences, that deciding to be nuclear would have serious implications for these new independent states, and it seems that there were many similarities, right? Security concerns, international nuclear order, and economic implications. Were there differences in how these two governments weigh consequences, and did they look at each other? Was there coordination in developing their approach? Let's start with the second question.
Great, wonderful question. So first one, how did Ukraine, Kazakhstan claim ownership? That first came to the fore when the issue of bringing into force, at least from my kind of perspective from the materials I've consulted, when the issue of bringing into force of the Strategic Arms Reductions and Limitations Treaty became sort of problematic very, very early on, end of 91, early 1992. That treaty was concluded. It was a bilateral treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was signed by Gorbachev and Bush, the elder, in Moscow on July 31st, 1991. 3 weeks later, there's a coup in Moscow. 3 months later, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. The treaty is signed, but it is not ratified. It's not brought into force. And the question becomes, well, how do we do it? And both the United States and Russia, of course, had a vested interest in keeping that treaty bilateral. And in January 1992, the very high-level interagency delegation headed by Reginald Bartholomew, who was Undersecretary of State for something, and they roll into the capitals, into Almaty and Kiev and Minsk, and of course Moscow, with this kind of plan, saying, all right, we really need to bring this treaty into force. We'd like to keep it bilateral because it's just easier, and we'll conclude, Russia then and the US Senate will ratify it, and then Russia will conclude implementation agreements with each one of the republics. And people in Almaty and in Kiev, and amazingly even in Minsk, said no way. These weapons are not territory. We are successor states of the Soviet Union. We want to deliberate this treaty that will affect assets on our territory in our parliaments. And what these two powerful states, right, two big nuclear powerful states that could really throw their weight around, what they realized was that sovereignty meant something, because they could simply just deny visas to the inspectors that would come to inspect. There was a very robust on-site inspections and verification regime that involved delegations coming back and forth and inspecting the sites where these weapons were dismantled. And Kazakhstan and Ukraine could simply deny visas to those inspectors. And so in these kind of almost formalistic ways, the countries asserted their sovereignty. And in the end, basically, the Soviet side of the START treaty had to be multilateralized to 4 parties. and, spelled out very precisely that their successor states in respect to this treaty, equal successor states, right? That was a very crucial language there. And that also meant that now this treaty went into their parliaments, they had to deliberate it, they had to ratify it, and so forth. Another way in which the negotiations happened was in terms of compensation for the fissile material that was contained in the warheads that were removed from the territory. Again, Russia said, all right, maybe, but as a gesture of goodwill, not as kind of entitlement for the property that, is properly Kazakhstan's and Ukraine's, and was given up as a gesture of goodwill. Again, there was a real aversion to acknowledging, giving credence to any claims outside of Russia to this nuclear legacy. And actually, the United States ended up mediating and being more understanding on this issue, and of course, financing and underwriting a lot of this compensation. So the former nuclear states, the Soviet nuclear successors, did get that compensation. But it's just what, Tigran and I were talking about. There really wasn't the issue of, say, conventional armaments or succession in conventional sense was not an international issue at all. It was something that was agreed between the republics, and for the most part, whatever tanks and aircraft and artillery pieces and everything was on the territory of the republics, it was properly theirs, and they had to cobble their armed forces out of that. The nuclear issue instantly became an issue of international security, and that was exactly for the reason of the existence of the international regime that managed nuclear possession. So in the end, they claimed ownership, but they could not properly name possession, as it were. The differences between Kazakhstan and Ukraine, I think you have to look at the political setup and the regime setup at the time. In Ukraine, the first free election in March of 1990, when it was still a republic of the Soviet Union, about a quarter of the seats goes to the so-called National Democratic Forces, to pro-independence, kind of former dissidents, and more nationalistically leaning type of political forces that clamor for greater autonomy or full independence from Moscow. This, and Tigran can explain more, this did not happen in Kazakhstan, even though you can say that indigenous sort of former communist elites did have Kazakh sort of interests at stake and engaged with Moscow kind of equitably. In Ukraine, there was a much greater sort of push towards a more, a faster and more radical way to distance the country from Moscow. And from what I understand, Kazakhstan, because Ukraine sort of became the problem child of post-Soviet nuclear disarmament, the Kazakh elites did pay attention to Ukraine's plight and kind of calibrate their engagement with, specifically with the Americans in accordance to that.
So to pick up on what Mariana mentioned, on START ratification, not only did they want to sign and ratify, but even, for something as symbolic on where to submit ratification documents, because initially there was an option, or maybe you give the documents to Russia and then Russia and US exchange. And no, like for Kazakhs, I'm speaking for Kazakhstan, it was like, no, we're not going via Moscow. We will do it also directly as a sovereign state, and in everything, not only on START, but on everything. In a way, it might seem as though it was only symbolism, but it was very important. They really felt that for every stage, it was important to be treated as separate, sovereign, independent states. In terms of how did Kazakhstan claim ownership, there were very practical arguments that it could make. It's obviously the Soviet nuclear testing program that used and abused Kazakh land, huge uranium resources that fed into the Soviet nuclear program, and all the nuclear facilities that were established in Kazakhstan. So there was a really strong and a legitimate belief that Kazakhstan contributed more than enough to the Soviet nuclear program to have, claim to those weapons. On the differences and how they weighed consequences and whether they looked at each other, Kazakhs definitely looked very much at Ukraine, and they were very adamant that they shouldn't get anything less. On certain issues, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine would speak to each other. It was, for example, when the United States offered denuclearization assistance under the non-Luga cooperative threat reduction program. I loved how I forgot at which level they met, but they were very adamant that this shouldn't become an apple of discord. It shouldn't be, that there is some argument about the shares or anything. So on some issues, they might have spoken to each other, but Kazakhstan was definitely being very aware of what Ukraine was doing, and for Kazakhstan, it was important that they are not treated as less, even though they understood that Ukraine was more important for the United States, as somebody in Kazakhstan said. Of course, we understood that Ukraine had more trump cards and kind of was on a higher priority level for Washington. And the differences, for me, the main difference is the, domestic politics, that in Ukraine, you had true diversity of political opinion and different groups vying for different options. Within Kazakhstan, it was so centralized, and it was, really Nazarbayev and just really a very few people around who were making decisions. So in a way, internally for Ukraine's leadership, it was a much more complicated process than it was for Kazakhstan in terms of just to which group you have to appeal. And in Kazakhstan, there were some vocal nationalist voices who were pro-nuclear, but they didn't have much political power. And also the nuclear sector was bankrupt. There was no military for the first few months of independence. And so in that sense, for me, that's the main difference, that it was a much smaller group of decision makers.
Okay, conscious of the time, I'll ask one question. I have a set of questions, but I'll ask one and then I'll open the floor. In hindsight, could anything, have been done differently to kind of get more security, whatever, like a better arrangement for the security? I understand it wasn't predetermined that Russia would go rogue, right? Like it was, I think, hard to imagine something like what we see now. But now, I mean, while you were writing the book, over the past year, I'm sure you had thoughts, and also it can be maybe it can give some food for thought what can be done not to kind of maintain this non-proliferation regime, knowing that this kind of formal security assurance is not such a big thing, right? When a small rogue state goes nuclear, it's a problem, right? But when a great nuclear power goes rogue, what do you do? Right? There isn't much that can be done. If in 2 minutes.
That's an easy question. Of course, I can get it to my. So in hindsight, and as you say, like the past changes, right, in the light of the present. So I finished kind of the book, and then the war started, and I had to address it in kind of these bits and pieces that I added to the introduction and conclusion. And I think my kind of tone was more hawkish, in those bits after that. So one thing that I'd like to say is that I think it's unfair to the leaders at the time, both certainly in Ukraine, but I imagine also Kazakhstan, to blame them for being naive and for being stupid and for not knowing what they did and kind of giving this stuff up. Ukrainians put up a fight. They negotiated, they punched way above their weight for such a kind of just a fledgling country, right? Still getting the way around the international politics and diplomacy and stuff. And they at least got a deal. I mean, the alternative was not getting more robust security guarantees, and the alternative was getting nothing at all, right? So I think this is what we have to acknowledge, give credit to the diplomats and the leaders that time, that they operated with very little leverage.
Books are
Yeah, with very little leverage, with two nuclear superpowers. So I think we have to give credit where credit is due. What the false dichotomy of whether like keeping the weapons, these particular weapons, or giving them all up, kind of framed the discussion. Whereas now, I mean, again, I'm not going to advocate for proliferation, but there were a lot of options in between of retaining some of the capacity that could at least keep the Western attention glued, and Western kind of security commitments more true to the spirit of whatever was signed, right? Ukraine has a huge nuclear power industry. 50% of Ukrainian electricity comes from nuclear energy. How about indigenous enrichment program for civilian needs? That also puts you in a different category with, people keeping an eye on what could happen if your security goes bad.
Right.
So something along those lines could have been potentially an option.
For Kazakhstan, similar, I was amazed by the audacity of Kazakh negotiators, because they were coming from a country that didn't even have hard currency, to travel to Washington DC. But the way they really, pushed and were trying to get what was necessary for Kazakhstan to survive as a state is pretty amazing in terms of practical things. And kind of looking back, which of course it would help if the Budapest Memorandum would be a more clearly defined enforcement mechanism. I regret that, and I blame the community as well, that we didn't have greater reaction to Crimea, and we didn't force this conversation to the forefront back then. And I think it's so important that Ukraine wins, and that's fundamental. Because then at least we can get, something like to say that, yeah, you can make the right choice that is right for you, right for the international security, right for the international non-proliferation regime, and that you survive as a country. And this is where our focus should be.
Okay. Thank you. With that, let's open the floor for questions. Yes.
Hi. My name is Ichiro, Japanese journalist, and who are in charge of covering the Ukraine since 2014 until 2018. And in 2019, I had a chance to visit the Semipalatinsk, and also I had a chance to visit the Kamensk, the chemical plant. And I found that in Kazakhstan, there are many strong, I would say strong nuclear industry still, but unfortunately in Ukraine, as Mariana said, frankly speaking, the chemical plant was just abandoned, and so only virtually nothing. So my question is, was there any option to have a nuclear weapon within the territory, and after that, dismantling the weapon within the territory would be the best option, because the Ukraine could have the better nuclear industry today.
So you mean to dismantle these nuclear weapons on Ukraine's territory?
Yeah.
That was a demand that Ukrainians did advance. Of course, the Russians were particularly against it, and the Americans refused to build a facility that would be able to do that. The Russians said that the weapons could be dismantled only by the people who build them, which was in Russia, and also that dismantling nuclear weapon would divulge kind of secrets, and that would be tantamount to transferring nuclear technology, would be in violation of the NPT obligations for nuclear weapon states. So that it was considered, or it was part of Ukraine's demands, but they couldn't get those met.
what was the difference between Kazakhstan, today's Kazakhstan and Ukraine?
Well, I mean, Kazakhstan was always better endowed in terms of nuclear fuel capacities. It had a fuel fabrication facility. It provided 50% of all the uranium mining, milling to the Soviet nuclear program. Speaking on behalf of Tugjan here. And Ukraine did have indigenous mining and milling, but it never had any other kind of links of the fuel cycle. Again, this is the technology of 1940s. This is, we think of things nuclear, something like cutting edge. It no longer is. Pakistan built the bomb and took a plutonium and a uranium route and considered both. DPRK, a country that starves its people to death, built these facilities. So it's not kind of a forbidding technology. It's just a matter of political will. You build these facilities, that all the spent nuclear fuel from Chernobyl. These are RBMK reactors. They're derivative of Soviet plutonium producing reactors. There's a ton of plutonium in that fuel. You build a plutonium reprocessing plant. Of course, everyone can see it. You can't build it underground and hide it. Then you run afoul with the international nonproliferation regime, and then you have to consider the cost of that.
On Kazakhstan, I would just add that, you said many strong nuclear industry facilities still. I would just change the word still to now, because there was a moment right after the collapse when everything collapsed and the main nuclear facility responsible for the entire nuclear fuel cycle went bankrupt. And so there was a huge dip, and then it was built up. For example, the national company Kazatomprom, and lots of cooperation with Japan as well. They really, and I want to credit the long-term former president of Kazatomprom, Jakishev, who did a lot to kind of get the facility out from the real crisis. But Kazakhstan is developing pretty well on the peaceful nuclear front.
After this.
But there was a moment in the early 90s when the entire industry was just bankrupt, as the rest of the industrial complex, because all the ties were broken between the republics and all the orders stopped. And so it was a very difficult moment. And maybe this is something that we need to kind of to drive even more. Ukraine and Kazakhstan of 91, 92 is not Ukraine and Kazakhstan of today. These countries were in crisis. They were poor. They had so many challenges on their hands, social, economic, and it's in these circumstances while really fighting to survive and build their sovereignty and statehood, they were making these hard decisions that they knew would they were so important both for their own security, but also for the international security. So I think these are really stories that should be lauded, and I think they should be credited that, yes, they made the right decision for that moment, and they should be credited for that.
Right, I mean, like on the consequentialist level, right? It's always you review these decisions based on the consequences of today. And I think, as Tugjan rightly put it, it is important that the lesson the country should take from the Ukrainian story is that it's better to have friends than weapons, right? And faithful friends, not fickle friends who will, depending on how the presidential elections or congressional elections go, might change the course. And so like that's what's at stake, right?
Wow, okay. You tried a lot of important things today. So with that, let me conclude. Let me close this event. Let's give a round of applause to our speaker. Usually at the end of the Zoom meeting, I say thank you to everybody, to the speakers, to people who came, tuned in, and to Chris and Kat.
Thank you.
Thank you.